There are moments in life when everything you thought you knew quietly falls apart. For me, that moment came lying alone in a cold hospital bed, staring up at fluorescent lights, waiting to be wheeled into surgery, while my parents, the people who had raised me, chose not to come. My name is Yulia. I'm 32 years old, and I live a pretty quiet life now in a small town just outside of Portland. I work in tech consulting, mostly from home, and spend my weekends volunteering at a local community center. It's a life built on simplicity, on careful choices, and lately, on a lot of hard-earned lessons. One of the hardest came when I was diagnosed with cancer last year. It wasn't advanced, thank God, but it was serious enough that I needed surgery, treatment, recovery time, and support. I reached out to my parents, the way any daughter would. I thought they'd be there. I thought family was supposed to show up when it mattered most. They didn't. And now, months later, fully aware of the silence they gave me when I needed them most, they sat across from me in my kitchen, sipping coffee, smiling like nothing had ever happened, and asked if I could loan them enough money to buy a bigger house. I smiled back. But inside, something had shifted. I wasn't the same daughter who once begged for their attention. I grew up in a small suburban neighborhood where keeping up appearances meant everything. My parents, Margaret and Dennis, weren't cruel people. They provided food on the table, made sure I went to decent schools, and threw carefully curated birthday parties every year. The kind where the cake was more important than who showed up. Looking back, love in our house was measured in report. Cards, polished shoes, and how perfectly we smiled for Christmas cards. Real emotions, messy, complicated, inconvenient, were something we quietly tucked away like worn-out sweaters. I was the oldest child, the responsible one, long before I even understood what responsibility meant. When my younger brother Mark forgot his homework or needed a ride to practice, it was me they called on, not each other. When the house needed cleaning before a family gathering, it was silently expected that I would stay up late making everything spotless. And when college tuition loomed, I chose a local, state school with a scholarship, because deep down, I knew better than to ask for help we couldn't afford. At least, that's what I believed for a long time. My dreams were never outrageous. I wanted to study environmental science, maybe work in conservation someday. I wanted a life that felt meaningful, but those dreams didn't exactly fit the neat image my parents had crafted. Saving the planet sounded messy. It wasn't something you could brag about at the bridge club, so I pivoted. I majored in business instead. Something practical, as my father liked to say. Graduated early, landed a stable consulting job, and moved into a small one-bedroom apartment not far from them. I built a life that made sense on paper, and deep down, I hoped that by doing everything right, I'd earn the closeness I secretly craved from them. It didn't quite happen that way. Over the years, there were countless small moments, things that didn't seem huge at the time, but built up quietly inside me, like the time I won a major award at work, and they left the event early because they didn't want to deal with traffic. Or when I needed help moving into my first apartment, and they dropped off a pizza but stayed for less than 10 minutes because they had dinner plans with friends. And then there were the subtle, bruising comments. Don't overreact. You're too sensitive. Other people have it worse, Yulia. I started learning not to need too much, not to expect too much, especially not when my health first began to falter. It started with small things. Dizziness, exhaustion, I couldn't explain away. I brushed it off for months, thinking maybe it was just stress. But when the symptoms worsened, when I found myself too weak to get out of bed some mornings, I finally worked up the courage to say something. I remember sitting across from them at Sunday dinner, my hands trembling slightly as I explained how I'd been feeling. My mother barely looked up from buttering her roll. My father shrugged and said, "You're young. You'll bounce back. At the time, I tried to believe them. I wanted to believe them. Because if the people who raised you don't think it's serious, maybe it's not. Only, it was. And later, after my diagnosis, I would find out something else. Something that stayed with me far longer than the physical scars. The financial struggle they always talked about, the reason I never asked for help. It wasn't the whole truth. They had money. Savings tucked away in accounts I didn't know about. Investments they had never mentioned. Enough to retire comfortably one day. Just not enough, apparently, to inconvenience themselves for me when it mattered. When I found that out, purely by accident, through a relative who let something slip at a holiday gathering, it hit harder than any financial figure ever could. They had resources. They just chose not to use them for me. Maybe because real love doesn't fit neatly onto a financial spreadsheet. Maybe because helping me wouldn't have looked good in their version of the story. Maybe because I had become too much work, too much need, too much reality in a world where everything was supposed to be polished and pretty. Whatever the reason, the damage was done still. I held on. To hope. To the idea that someday something would change. That maybe if I proved myself just a little more, earned a bigger title, bought a better car, showed up smiling no matter how I felt, they would finally see me. It's strange how deeply we can cling to the people who hurt us the most. Not out of weakness, but because some part of us still believes in the promises they never made. Back then, I hadn't yet realized that survival sometimes means letting go. Not just of dreams, but of the people you thought would always be part of them. When the diagnosis came, it felt like the ground dropped out from under me. One minute, I was sitting in a sterile exam room, tapping my foot against the linoleum floor, trying to believe it was all a mistake. Next, I was staring at a doctor whose mouth kept moving, but whose words blurred together into a thick, terrifying fog. Cancer. It wasn't advanced, they said. It was treatable, they said. But none of those words reached me in any way that mattered. Because all I could think about, in that hollow moment, was that I didn't want to do this alone. The first people I called were my parents. I didn't even think about it. It was instinctive, like breathing. Because no matter how many times they had let me down in small ways before, this was different. This was life and death. I still believed that when it truly mattered, they would show up. The conversations were short. My mother's voice was tight when she answered, like I had interrupted something important. When I told her, there was a brief pause, just a few seconds. But I heard it, that tiny moment of calculation. "We're really busy at work right now, Yulia," she said. "Your father and I both have big projects. It's just bad timing. Bad timing. For cancer." I tried to explain about the surgery, about how I'd need someone to drive me home afterward, about the bills I was staring down with a knot in my stomach. She made soft, vague noises, the kind people make when they want you to believe they care, but not enough to change their plans. "We'll figure something out," she said before hanging up. Except we didn't. In the weeks leading up to my surgery, I juggled doctor's appointments, insurance battles, and late-night panic attacks, mostly on my own. I asked again, for a ride, for help coordinating appointments, for just someone to sit with me in the waiting room. Each time, the answer was a variation of the same theme. "We're too busy. You'll manage. You're strong." I stopped asking after a while. The morning of my surgery, I took a rideshare to the hospital, sat alone under the harsh fluorescent lights, clutching a clipboard full of paperwork no one had explained to me. Nurses bustled past, calling out names, exchanging polite smiles. I sat there, invisible. A grown woman facing something unimaginable, completely alone. When they called me back, I almost didn't stand up, Part of me wanted to disappear into the thin, cracked cushion of that waiting room chair. But I didn't. I got up, and I walked back, alone. Later, groggy and disoriented after the surgery, I woke up to an empty recovery room. No balloons, no flowers, no familiar faces. Just the steady beep of machines and the aching, hollow realization that some absences are louder than any noise. A few days after I was discharged, still dizzy from the medication and barely able to keep food down, I dragged myself to a family gathering, a birthday dinner for my cousin. I thought maybe they didn't realize how much I needed them. Maybe if they saw me, pale, weak, moving like a ghost, they would understand. Instead, I overheard my mother laughing with one of her friends in the kitchen. "Yulia is always so dramatic," she said lightly, pouring herself a glass of wine. "It's not even a real cancer. It's the kind they catch early. She acts like she's on death's door." The words sliced through me cleaner than any scalpel ever could. I stood there, frozen. The sounds of plates clinking and voices chatting around me blurring into a meaningless hum. Because in that moment, I realized something that would never unstick itself from my mind. It wasn't just that they were busy. It wasn't just bad timing. They didn't see me. Not the real me. Not the terrified, broken human being who had clung to the hope of their love. Like a life raft. They saw inconvenience, embarrassment, drama. And suddenly, so much of my life made sense. All the times I had hustled for their approval, bent myself into quieter shapes to fit their polished world, it had never been about love. It had been about obligation. About control. About keeping the story of the perfect family alive at any cost. And if I didn't serve that story, I became a footnote. Sitting in that too bright living room, nursing a glass of water while everyone laughed and passed around plates of pasta, I made a quiet decision. I wouldn't beg anymore. Not for their love, not for their approval, not for anything. Love and loyalty, the kind I had given so freely, had to be mutual. Otherwise, they were just chains you wrapped around your own heart, and I was finally ready to start cutting them loose. I listened, I nodded, but I didn't offer. Not once. And the more they struggled, the more they seemed to notice how stable I was. One afternoon, my father made a passing comment, half joking, half probing. "Looks like our little girl is doing pretty well for herself these days." I smiled politely, said nothing. It was strange, almost surreal seeing the shift. The people who had once looked at me like an obligation, an inconvenience, now looked at me like a potential safety net. But I didn't owe them my success. Not the way they thought. They hadn't been there when I needed a ride to the hospital. They hadn't been there when I sat alone through terrifying nights, wondering if I would see another year. They hadn't been there. Period. And now, everything I had built, every piece of stability and strength I had carved out of those broken years, belonged to me. Not to them. Not to anyone who saw me only when it was convenient. The more they hinted, the more boundaries I built. Softly, firmly. I stopped sharing financial details with them, stopped inviting casual conversations about work, about money, about anything they could twist into a favor. When they asked how things were going, I kept it simple. Good, busy, staying focused. I let the silence between us grow until it became a wall, not of anger, but of self-respect. And it was in that silence that I realized something. True healing isn't flashy. It's not a grand speech or a dramatic confrontation. It's 1,000 small choices to choose yourself, to protect your peace, to value your worth, even if no one else ever sees it. By the time the day came when they would finally ask for something bigger, something audacious, I was ready, not with bitterness, not with resentment, but with quiet strength and the unshakable knowledge that I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. least of all to the people who had left me to fight my battles alone. It happened one Sunday afternoon, almost exactly a year after my surgery. The kind of day when the air is just beginning to turn crisp, hinting at the change of seasons. I had invited my parents over for coffee, a gesture of civility more than anything else. Part of me still believed in keeping some thread of connection, however thin. They arrived 20 minutes late, of course, bustling in with loud greetings and plastic smiles. My mother commented on how cozy my condo was, her eyes scanning the space in a way that made me feel like a product being inspected. I brewed coffee, set out a small plate of pastries. We made awkward small talk for a while. The weather, the latest neighborhood gossip, a distant cousin's engagement. It all felt brittle, rehearsed, as if we were playing parts we no longer remembered how to perform. And then, as the conversation lulled, my father leaned back in his chair and cleared his throat. "You know, Yulia," he said, "your mother and I have been thinking." My stomach tightened, a small, familiar knot forming. The same knot that always preceded something unpleasant dressed up as a casual suggestion. "We're ready to make a move," he continued, smiling. "Finally buy that bigger house we've always dreamed of." I nodded politely, unsure why they were telling me this. "And," my mother chimed in, stirring her coffee, "we figured, well, considering how well you're doing these days." She let the sentence trail off, leaving the implication hanging thickly between us. I stayed quiet, letting the silence stretch. My father chuckled, trying to lighten the moment. "You've built a good life for yourself, sweetheart. We're so proud. And, well, we thought maybe you could help us out a little." Help. The word hung there like a loaded gun. They wanted a loan. A large one, judging by the numbers they started. Throwing around a few moments later, down payments, interest rates, timelines. It was clear they had thought this through. Clearer still, they assumed I would say yes. After all, hadn't they raised me? Hadn't they given me everything? As they talked, layering their casual request with not-so-subtle guilt, something inside me shifted. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even sadness. It was clarity. They had left me alone in a hospital bed. They had dismissed my pain, minimized my fears, and gossiped about my struggles behind my back. And now, when it suited them, they were ready to cash in on a relationship they had already bankrupted years ago. I listened carefully, nodding occasionally, keeping my face neutral. Inside, I was burning. Not with anger, but with the fierce, unshakable knowledge that I had finally outgrown the story they kept trying to write me into. At one point, my mother even laughed softly and said, "Don't forget where you came from, Yulia. Family sticks together." The irony nearly knocked the air out of me. Family sticks together, except when you're too sick to stand, except when your fear is inconvenient, except when real love requires real sacrifice. Then, apparently, family gets busy. I looked at them, really looked. And for the first time, I didn't see the towering figures of my childhood. I saw two people who had made choices. Choices that had nothing to do with me. Choices I didn't have to pay for. When they finally stopped talking, when the numbers and guilt trips and carefully rehearsed justifications ran dry, I smiled. A small, polite smile. The kind you give a stranger who has mistaken you for someone else. "I'll think about it," I said simply. And in that moment I wasn't lying, because I would think about it, briefly, in the same way you might think about taking a wrong turn before staying firmly on the path you know leads home. They left, shortly after, chattering about open houses and dream kitchens and renovations they already had in mind. They hugged me goodbye a little too tightly, as if sealing the unspoken contract they believed they had just secured. I stood at the door after they left, watching their car disappear down the street. The house felt quiet, still, almost reverent, and somewhere deep inside me, a final thread snapped, not with violence, but with a gentle release. I didn't owe them anything. Not my money, not my time, not my loyalty. Family isn't who shares your blood. Family is who shows up when it matters. And when I had needed them most, they hadn't just failed the test, they hadn't even bothered to show up. The next chapter of my life, the one I would build with my own hands, my own heart, would not include debts I never agreed to owe. It was a betrayal, yes. But it was also a beginning. The beginning of something stronger and far more precious than any house, any loan, any hollow version of love, the beginning of my real life. It took me about a week to make my decision, not because I was torn, not really, but because I wanted to be deliberate, careful. Old habits die hard, and part of me still wrestled with the instinct to soften the blow, to cushion the truth. But the stronger part of me, the part that had weathered hospital rooms alone and built a life from the rubble of disappointment, knew exactly what needed to happen. When I finally called them, my voice was calm, steady. We exchanged a few minutes of meaningless pleasantries before I steered the conversation to the reason they'd been waiting for. "I've thought about it," I said simply. On the other end of the line, I could hear the sharp intake of breath, hope, calculation. "And," my mother prompted, trying to sound casual, but her voice was a little too tight. "I won't be able to help you with the house," I said. There was a beat of silence, heavy, brittle. "I've decided to focus my financial resources on people and causes that were there for me during the hardest times of my life," I continued, my voice soft but unyielding, "on building a future rooted in gratitude, not obligation." I didn't yell, I didn't accuse, I simply told the truth. On the other end, the reactions were swift, predictable. First came confusion, then indignation. "You owe us, Yulia," my father said, his voice rising. "After everything we did for you." "I understand you feel that way," I said quietly. "But I don't see it the same." Another pause, another furious silence, and then the final desperate card. "Don't forget where you came from." I smiled, even though they couldn't see it. "I haven't forgotten," I said. "That's exactly why I'm making this decision." I ended the call politely, firmly, no yelling, no drawn-out arguments, just a clear, clean boundary drawn where there had never been one before. And it felt peaceful. Later that week, I made another decision, one that felt like sealing the chapter closed for good. I took a significant portion of what I would have loaned them, money I had worked hard to save, and made a donation to a local cancer support foundation. Not in my name, anonymously. It wasn't about grand gestures. It was about honoring the invisible network of kindness that had quietly carried me through the darkest time of my life. Nurses who stayed late, neighbors who dropped off meals, friends who texted at midnight just to say, "I'm here." They were my real family, the family you find, not the one you're born into. And even though my parents would never know about the donation, even though there would be no recognition or fanfare, it didn't matter. I knew. And that was enough. A few weeks later, I shared my story, not the details of the loan request, but the broader truth, at a small community event hosted by the Cancer Foundation. It was a modest gathering, maybe 40 or 50 people, sitting on folding chairs under strings of soft lights. I stood at the podium, my heart hammering against my ribs, and told the story of a woman who faced fear alone and found unexpected strength not in the people she had trusted the most, but in strangers, in friends, in herself. I spoke calmly, without bitterness. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. The ones who needed to hear it would recognize themselves or Or no. Either way, it wasn't about them anymore. It was about the others sitting quietly in the crowd, nodding, understanding, seeing pieces of their own journey reflected back at them. Healing doesn't always come in a tidal wave. Sometimes it's a small, steady drip. A new story replacing the old one drop at a time. The ripple effects came slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first, a few relatives, ones I hadn't spoken to much in years, reached out. Some sent simple messages. Thinking of you. You're stronger than you know. Some apologized, quietly, for not being there. And others distanced themselves from my parents. The polite smiles faded. The invitations dried up. The whispered praise they had once basked in turned into uncomfortable silences. I never spoke badly about them. Never corrected or exaggerated. I didn't need to. The truth has a way of revealing itself, even without a spotlight. One evening, months later, I ran into an old family friend at the grocery store, a woman who had once been one of my mother's closest confidants. After a few minutes of small talk, she leaned in and said quietly, "Some people only show up when it's easy. You showed up for yourself when it wasn't. Don't ever apologize for that." I smiled, thanked her, and walked away, feeling lighter than I had in years. My parents never directly confronted me again about the loan. They made a few half-hearted attempts at reaching out, strained holiday greetings, awkward invitations I politely declined. But the relationship had changed, permanently. Not out of anger, out of understanding. I finally saw them clearly, without the haze of childhood loyalty, or the desperate hope for something they were never able to give. And in that clarity, I found freedom. I built a life that honored the lessons, both beautiful and brutal, that my journey had taught me. A life rooted not in obligation, but in authenticity. And every time I passed the community center where I had once stood, heart pounding, telling my story for the first time, I remembered, the best revenge isn't anger, it's peace, it's joy. It's a life that no one can take credit for but you. And quietly, without fanfare, I kept living it. The fallout didn't happen overnight. It was slower than that. A gradual crumbling, almost imperceptible at first. It started with small things. An invitation was not extended, a once close family friend who stopped. Returning calls. Neighbors who used to wave enthusiastically are now offering only polite nods across the street. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining it, but over time, the pattern became too clear to ignore. The image my parents had worked so hard to curate, the perfect, successful pillar of the community facade, was cracking, and the people around them noticed. It wasn't that I had said anything publicly, hadn't aired dirty laundry. I hadn't shouted my story from the rooftops or written dramatic posts online. I had simply told the truth, quietly, when asked. And, perhaps more importantly, I had refused to play my assigned role anymore. When friends and distant relatives reached out, sensing something had shifted, I didn't hide the facts. I shared calmly that when I went through my health crisis, support hadn't come from where I had expected it. I didn't embellish. I didn't accuse. I just told the truth. And people, it turns out, are better at reading between the lines than we often give them credit for. I heard little snippets, here and there. Someone mentioned how strange it was that my parents had seemed so absent during my recovery. A quiet comment about their sudden financial troubles. A cousin mentioned, almost offhandedly, that loyalty should be a two-way street. Each piece was small. Alone, it would have meant nothing. Together, they painted a new picture. One thing my parents couldn't easily control. The house they had dreamed of buying slipped further and further out of reach. Their financial struggles, once whispered about only behind closed doors, became common knowledge within our small community. The old friends they had once boasted about began keeping their distance. The charity committees they had chaired quietly replaced them. Holiday gatherings became smaller, quieter. It wasn't a dramatic fall from grace. It was something sadder somehow, a slow, lonely fading out. They tried reaching out to me again. First, with an email, overly cheerful, pretending nothing had ever happened. Then a voicemail, my mother's voice tight with forced affection, inviting me over for dinner, just to catch up. I responded politely but with firm boundaries. "Thanks for the invitation," I texted back, "but I'm focusing on my own peace right now." Short, kind, unmistakably clear. They tried again a few weeks later, asking if I would consider helping them get back on their feet, framing it as a new beginning for the family. I didn't even hesitate. This time, "I hope you find the support you need," I wrote. "But it won't be from me." There was no malice in my words, just the simple acknowledgement of reality. Protecting my peace, protecting the life I had fought to build, meant letting them face the consequences of their choices, and they did. Their financial mismanagement, once hidden beneath appearances, became undeniable. Late payments, downsizing, selling off small assets they had once flaunted, they hadn't just lost a loan, they had lost something far more valuable: respect, trust. I didn't rejoice in it. There was no victory lap, no secret gloating, just a quiet, steady peace inside me. Because the real win wasn't watching them fall. It was knowing that I hadn't fallen with them, that I had chosen differently, chosen myself, even when it would have been easier, safer, more familiar to keep playing my part in their story. 1. Evening, I sat on my small porch, a cup of tea warming my hands, as the sun dipped behind the trees, and I realized, in a way that settled deep into my bones, sometimes the greatest act of love you can give, to yourself and even to others, is to let them experience the full weight of their own decisions. No rescues, no second chances, are handed out like candy. No more sacrificing your well-being to cushion the fall of those who refuse to stand by you. Just quiet, firm boundaries, and the knowledge that real family, real love, is built not on obligation, but on choice. And I had finally chosen right. It's strange, the way pain carves new spaces inside you, spaces you didn't know you needed until they were there. If you had asked me 2 years ago what would happen if my parents abandoned me when I needed them most, I would have said it would break me. And in some ways, it did. But what I didn't realize then was that sometimes breaking isn't the end. Sometimes it's the beginning. Today, my life is quieter, smaller, maybe, from the outside looking in, but fuller, richer, in ways that truly matter. On weekends, I host simple dinners with a handful of friends who feel more like family than blood ever did. We squeeze around my little kitchen table, passing dishes back and forth, laughing at jokes that don't need explaining. There's no performance here, no perfectly curated image to uphold, just people who show up, messy, flawed, real. One evening, as we sat around the table, someone raised a glass, a small casual toast to surviving another hectic week, and I looked around at the faces lit by soft light, and I realized this was what I had been searching for, all along. Not grand gestures, not approval dressed up as love, not transactions masquerading as family, just this: presence, honesty, care. The scar tissue left from everything I endured, the loneliness, the betrayal, the quiet goodbyes I never got to say. It's still there. It always will be. But it doesn't ache the way it used to. It doesn't define me anymore. Every choice I made after that hospital bed, every small, stubborn step toward healing, built a life where I didn't have to beg to be seen, Didn't have to earn affection by shrinking myself. I built a life rooted in self-respect, in boundaries that didn't waver under pressure, in love that didn't keep score. A few months ago, I received a card in the mail, handwritten, familiar script. It was from my parents. A half-hearted apology, if you could even call it that. Thin on specifics, heavy on nostalgia. A few lines about missing the old days, about family always. Finding a way back. I read it once, carefully, folded it neatly, and tucked it away in a drawer. Not because I was holding on to it, but because I didn't need to hold on to it at all. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't always a loud declaration. Sometimes, it's just letting go, letting the past be the past, without dragging it forward into a future it no longer deserves to shape. I didn't respond, not out of cruelty, but because there was nothing left to say. I had already found everything I needed. I found it in the slow mornings, brewing coffee while the sun poured through my kitchen windows. I found it in the laughter around my crowded table, in the quiet strength of friends who showed up without being asked. I found it in the mirror, in the steady, unflinching gaze of a woman who had learned to save herself. The truth is, betrayal doesn't just break your heart, it breaks your illusions. It clears the wreckage of who you thought you needed to be, and it leaves behind something fiercer, something freer. I wouldn't have chosen the pain, but I'm grateful for what it revealed, for what it made possible. Today, I live with a calm strength that doesn't need to announce itself. It's there in the way I protect my peace, in the way I choose, every day, to build a life that feels like mine, and no one else's. Sometimes, people ask me if I regret cutting ties, if I miss what I lost. And the honest answer is, I miss the idea of what could have been, not the reality of what was. That distinction has made all the difference. Because now, when I think about family, I don't think about bloodlines or borrowed loyalty. I think about love that shows up, love that stays, love that asks nothing but your presence in return. And sitting there at that dinner table, laughter ringing around me like a balm, I realized maybe I hadn't lost a family. Maybe I had finally found one.